Good day, friends. Thank you so much for joining yet another episode of Share the Well. And today's conversation is going to be with Chris, a good friend of mine for the last decade and a half. We met when I was in Bangalore. So we continued that friendship and God has sustained our friendship. You may be a little confused when you hear him, imagining him to be a pastor or a theologian or a teacher. To be honest with you, he is one. He's read enough to be one. But in his day job, he's a physician. And I think we begin this conversation with his experience of serving and caring for the COVID patients. And you can see some of the pressures that our doctors have gone through. Chris works in a state called Kerala in India. I'm sure that experience is an epitome of what's happening across the world. And many of the developed economies are recovering or on the path of recovery, but many of the developed countries are on the path of recovery, but the developing countries are still facing challenges. And Chris is in the firefight mode to kind of help there. But our conversation is all about God and theology, and if you're intrigued and interested in that aspect, this conversation will really help you. Though we don't agree, in the way we see things, but that's the point, right? I mean, that's what we said we would do in Share the Well, is bring about different points of view. Though we don't agree, we don't have to cancel one another. We don't have to be irritated with one another, but we can share with one another what we think and how we see the world, and learn from one another and respect one another. So that's the point of this conversation. Chris and I enjoy the conversation. I'll talk to you guys at the end of this episode.
So I was talking about Psalm 51:5. So behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Now you replace that word sin with anything else, and you get a completely different meaning. Like, for example, in love, my mother hugged me. Who was in love? My mother. In anger, my mother slapped me. Who was angry? My mother. In sin, my mother conceived me. Who was sinning? My mother. I mean, that would make sense. That approach would make sense. But we've turned it around to mean in sin, my mother conceived me, means I was sinful when my mother conceived. Right? So that's not something that you get from a plain reading of the passage. That's one thing. The other thing is, when you go to the Septuagint, you have the word. So if the idea is in sin my mother conceived me, meaning the idea being that I was conceived sinful, or with original sin, or with that concept in mind. But when you go to the Septuagint, you see that it's talking about sins in the plural. In sins my mother conceived me, right? And there it's very clear, where it's not talking about a singular sin. It cannot be talking about sinful nature if it's multiple sins. So it's talking about something else. And the Septuagint was translated by Jews before the incarnation of Jesus Christ. So they understood what they were doing, what the passage meant. And I would assume that they were faithful in translating it well. All that we know about the New Testament, much of what we know about the New Testament, is that they heavily used the Septuagint. Most of the, many, if not most of the use of Old Testament in the New Testament usually refers to the Septuagint verses. So we know from the New Testament that the New Testament authors were very comfortable using the Septuagint, and they had a very good knowledge of the Septuagint. So going by that, again, in sin my mother conceived. In fact, even in the Hebrew, it's quite clear. In Hebrew, it's just 3 words. It says in 3 or 4 words. In sin, she conceived me, mother of me. That in sin is 1 word. She conceived me is 1 word. Mother of me, my mother, is 1 word. So it's everything that the woman is doing, the mother of David is doing, but somehow we've turned it around to mean that it's talking about David himself. Then you come to Romans 5:12 to 21. There's the entire problem of original sin really boils down to an error in translation by the Latin translators when they translated the Vetus Latina. So you had the New Testament in Greek, you had the entire book of Romans, the letter to the Romans in Greek, and that got translated into Latin. Now, when it got translated into Latin, the way they translated Romans 5:12 was, um, um, and in sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and death spread to all men because all sin. Right? Let me read that. Therefore, as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. Right? Now, when we read this, let's read it first simply. Sin came into the world how? Through one man. We all know who that man is, Adam. Right?
Right.
Statement number 2, death through sin. So Adam brought sin into the world, sin brought death into the world. And so death spread to all men because all sinned. Okay, now there's a few things we have to look at over here. One, death spread to all men not because Adam sinned, death spread to all men because all men sinned. Right? So that's number 1. Number 2, when we read, and so death spread to all men, there is a tendency for us to understand the word so as therefore. In fact, the Greek word doesn't mean therefore, it means similarly. So it is the first part. Actually, in the Greek, it reads, just as sin entered into the world through one man and death through sin, similarly, death spread to all men because all men sin. Right? Now, in the Vetus Latina, what happens is they translated it as they all sinned in they translated it in such a way that it comes out to mean that they all sinned in Adam, right? In him all sinned, or something like that. But that's not what the Greek says. And in fact, most of our English translations are also quite they're not clear on how they translate this passage. But if you go to the Greek and you check it out, the first part is just as, and there's a statement. Similarly, this statement. So just as death came, similarly, death comes here also. How did death come? Through sin. How does death spread? Through sin, right? So it's not because Adam sinned, therefore. We should not read the so as therefore. Rather, the Greek over there means similarly. And so then you come to the next verse. Sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not imputed where there is no law. We always talk about the imputation of sin, right? Now, ironically, there are only 2 passages in the Bible that talk about imputation of anything. One is in Philemon, when Paul tells Philemon to impute whatever debt Onesimus has to him, to his account, something about debt and imputing in Philemon. And the only other place where you see something talked about imputation is here in verse 13, where it says that sin is not imputed where there is no law. Right? What's the first part of the verse? Sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, and it's talking about, we come to know through the next verse what law he's talking about. Right? He's not talking about the so-called Noahide laws. Right? The Noahide laws is not something that's found in the Bible, by the way, even though it's very popular in when we have a Judeo-Christian talk and all. And it's not talking about the Adamic law. Noahide laws very specifically talks about the Mosaic law, which we understand when we read the next verse. Yet death. So look at this. Before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law, yet death reigned from Adam to Moses. Meaning, even though there was no law, death reigned from Adam to Moses. Why stop with Moses? Because through Moses came, right? Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam. Now, look at that. Death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam. Now, if I am guilty for Adam's sin, am I not, haven't I had the transgression of Adam on me? Don't I, in some form, have the transgression of Adam in me or on me or through me? Or haven't I done the transgression of Adam? Yet it speaks, death reigned even over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam. It doesn't even say not the transgression of Adam. It says not like the transgression of Adam, right? Which gives you one more step of separation. So that comes, and then when we read verses 15 to 21, one of the interesting things you have to note is that in the translation, one of the things that this is a very difficult passage to translate, but one of the things we have to recognize is that what the translators have done is that they have inserted a lot of words in verses 15 to mostly 15 to 19, right? They have inserted a lot of words that aren't there in the Greek. And these words, what they really do is they give you the theology of the translator rather than actually tell you what the word means. Because in two complete verses, or rather two complete phrases, there are no verbs. And if you look through this passage from 15 to 19, you see verbs throughout. But in two passages, there are no verbs. And when you think about it, where is a sentence? What is a sentence that you have where you don't use verbs? It's usually saying, right? Or, um, something where there's a saying is probably the only place I can think of where you don't have verbs. You just have you have sayings like that. They're very rare, but you have sayings where there's no verbs in them. And so you have two of those over here. And the other thing that you see is that the word man is repeatedly used, even though it's not there in the Greek. In fact, I've marked this out over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times the word man is used between verses 16 and 8. In fact,
15 all the way.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, from 15 onward, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times the word man is written in the English, even though it never occurs in the Greek, right? And there's a lot of the translators, I'm sure they had a difficult time with this passage, but the way this passage can be read is quite different from the way most people have translated it. And I'm not blaming them. I'm not saying that they knowingly did this. It's obvious when you do a translation that your theology comes through, right? It doesn't make sense for you to do a translation and your theology not come through, right? It's easy to say that I'm very mechanical when I do my translation, but every translation is an interpretation. Very rarely do you get a translation where there's no interpretation. And so this is again one of those passages where you can't really get the doctrine of total depravity out of this. So then I go to the theology, and then you go to the theology online, all you see is reformed stuff. I mean, the first 2-3 pages, think about it. The Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church is far bigger than the Protestant Church. When you put them together, you barely see anything by any of their websites on the internet. I mean, you can scroll, you can put in a topic, theological topic online, and just keep scrolling page after page. You won't find a single Catholic. You might even find a Catholic after a few pages, but an Eastern Orthodox writing on something, very difficult to come by, right? That's simply because the Reformed people have had an outsized interest in actually putting down what they believe, right? They've actually had a major impact on the world, on Christianity in the world, simply because they were faithful in writing down what they believed, right? We've had I mean, there were 12 apostles, but we have only the writings of 2 apostles, or rather, we have more, but I mean, the Gospels are only of 2. You have Matthew and you have John. The other 10 apostles haven't written a gospel, right? So we have the complete worldview of Matthew and John given to us in the Gospels. You have a better understanding of John's understanding of Christ because he's also written 3 letters and the book of Revelation, right? We've got a little bit of an understanding about Peter because he's written 2 letters. James, because he's written a letter, but that James might be the brother of Jesus, might not even be the apostle James, right? So the fact that writing something down, keeping it for posterity, that has a huge impact on forming theology and all of that. So I would rather uh, put the blame at the feet of those who haven't written down what they believe, rather than blame the reformed people for being faithful in putting down what they believe, right? It is important that all sides come out, and for all sides to come out, all sides have to write, right? If all sides don't write, you never know what the other side believed. And very often what we see is that the person who writes down always wants to magnify his own view. It's natural. There's nothing unnatural about it. I would always like to think that what I have written is right. And I would like to think that I want as many people on my side as I can. And so what do? I make the other side look bad, right? So there are a lot of straw man arguments that are put forward, but um, I think I would not blame the reformed people for doing what they do. I would say that those who are not reformed have a responsibility to carry out their work. Now, I would love for all Catholics and Orthodox people in the world to become evangelical, right? I, uh, I would love that. But at the same time, we should recognize there's a lot of rich thought that's already been poured over, written, reams have been written about so many doctrines of which we are inheritors. The Reformed Church is largely an inheritor of Augustinian theology. And it is important for the Protestant Church to recognize that Augustinian theology was not the only Roman Catholic theology. In fact, Eastern Orthodox theology is quite different from Roman Catholic theology, even though when we look at it, we think, okay, they're 2 peas in a pod. We think they're both the same. They're very different. They're very different. And we think of the Roman Catholic Church as a monolith. It isn't. They've got divisions within the church. You've got the liberal side, you've got the conservative side. Even theologically, the Franciscan is not the same as the Jesuit, right? There are differences. The Thomistic person is not the same as the Augustinian person. There are real theological differences even within the Roman Catholic Church. And so it's important that we recognize that and see that. So I was telling you, what original sin. So there is one side of the Roman Catholic Church that believes that original sin can be defined as prior to the fall of Adam, you had the spirit ruling over the soul and the soul ruling over the body, right? And after the fall, that got all mangled up, right? That is their understanding of original sin. And then they use 2 words for guilt, right? They say it doesn't really mean guilt in the way we in the English world understand guilt. They say culpa and riatus, right? And they say that it is one, but it's not the other. And so you're not really guilty for Adam's sin, but you will bear the consequences of Adam's sin, or something of that sort, right? You have something in the Eastern Orthodox Church where they have a completely different view of Adam being born not perfect and then falling from that great height of perfection, but rather Adam having been born, having been made um, not imperfect, but with an ability to attain to uh,
Perfection.
perfection. There's a word they use for that. Uh, um, I forget the word. It's not exactly divinity. It's something about getting together with the divine nature. Actually, really, all it means is sanctification. But the word they use is so problematic that as soon as you hear it, you're like, that's heresy. Because it almost sounds like they're saying that they can become God. That's not what they're saying. It's basically a talk about being sanctified into the image of God. And so you have that. And then you have the Anabaptist church where they don't believe in original sin at all. You got Balthasar Hubmaier, who's a little on both sides about this, but then Pilgram Marpeck in the Anabaptist church is quite clear that he doesn't believe in total depravity and all of that. You have all of that, but none of these people have written as much as the Reformed Church have written. And when I say Reformed Church, I'm talking primarily the Presbyterian, Anglican, Lutheran churches, right? The Baptists have come out with a few books, but the Baptists are kind of split between Calvinist, Arminian, and Provisionist right now, right? And so you have three groups of three kinds of salvation, all coming from the same denomination. And now there's a lot of, at least a few years back, there was quite a bit of entanglement between the Calvinist and the Provisionist side, but it's all fizzling out now, I guess. And then you look at the mainline churches in India. Where do we get our theology from? We get all our theology from the West. Where do we get our books from? We get all our books from the West. Who writes our theology? John Piper does. John MacArthur does. It all gets translated into Hindi and Malayalam. That's all. It's all their work, right? So we don't have in India. We do have, but they're not famous. They're not popularized. We do have theologians, but they're not of this. They're not as famous as or as influential as these men. You ask any Tom, Dick, and Harry on the road, if you're a Christian, do you know any theologian, any pastor? Name somebody famous. Immediately, who are the names that come to mind?
I know.
John Piper, John MacArthur, Albert Mohler, R.C. Sproul. You ask me, I'll take a time to think of somebody else. It'll take me time, even though I'm, swimming in this. So it took me a while to find a few good authors who have biblical views. And one of the things to recognize is, even as Tulip was constructed and given to the world, there were a lot of people who signed off on it, who said, we don't completely agree with everything that this says, right? But for the sake of the unity,
5-point Calvinism.
Yeah, but
The 5-point, yeah.
We will agree. And one of the main sticking points was limited atonement, right? Many of the greatest Calvinists were 4-point Calvinists, simply because they could not accept limited atonement. And so they're called Amyraldians. Has anyone heard the name Amyraldian?
Nope.
No one's even heard what Amyraldian is. Nobody knows what Amyraldian means. But 4-point Calvinists who believe that atonement is not limited, they are called Amyraldians. And who's heard of them? How many books do you know of them? Because even Amyraldians never call themselves that. They call themselves Calvinists. Because that's the framework out of which they come, right? So then you have, so that's why I went into the historical thing then to find out where did all this come from. And so I found that this idea of total depravity was not much older than Augustine himself. So for the first 400 years of the church, there was nothing called total depravity. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, even the term original sin may have been coined by Augustine, for all I know. But the idea is that the first 400 years of the church, everyone, all the early church writers, they call them the early church fathers, they all believed in free will. They all believed that infants are not guilty of Adam's sin. They all believed that, atonement, that Christ died for everyone. In fact, to say otherwise, in fact, believe in limited atonement was heresy, and it was actually condemned as heresy in the church. And so you have all of that, but you never hear any of that, right? So I feel it's just a failure on our part, on my part, on people who believe as I do, that we haven't written down our beliefs, and we haven't told the world about.
Okay, so the recording is on. But go ahead. You were saying, Chris, go for it.
This last week's been quite intense. Every day morning you go to work, you get the list of cases you need to see, go to the ward, and you get into the PPE kit. PPE is short for personal protective equipment. Getting into that is like getting into a furnace. You get into it, and like in 5 minutes, you're sweating head to toe. And then, you go in, you see each patient, you get their vitals, you record it, you inform the person outside, because you can't handle, you're not allowed to handle the file while you're in the PPE. So there's another doctor with you writing down the notes that you dictate to them. And then you go on to the next patient, and then you repeat. So you see the patient, you talk to them, examine them, check their vitals, inform the doctor outside, and then she puts down the notes. Once you're done with rounds, at least after having seen all the cases, you get back, get out of the PPE kit first thing, and then get the file, and then go through all the investigations, see how the patient's gotten better compared to yesterday, compared to last week, if the patient's been here that long. And just give the advice for the day. And it's basically it. And then after that, you go down, depending on which ward you're doing rounds in, you have a particular doctor, to a senior to report to. So you report to that senior, you tell them all the actions that you've taken for your cases, and then if required, they let you know what further needs to be done. Otherwise, the next step is to go ahead and call all the bystanders, because call the relatives, because people are not allowed to stay in a COVID bystanders. So that's what we do. We call up the relatives, and we inform them about the patient's condition, and that's pretty much our day.
Anyway, before we go ahead, I have some questions just around this. Why don't I ask the guests to just introduce themselves, so it's it's easy. So just a brief introduction, Chris, about you, that'll be awesome.
Yeah. Okay, so my name is Chris. Born and raised in Kuwait. I was there during the Gulf War. We lived in Kuwait for another 2 months after Iraq had invaded Kuwait. A lot of interesting stories that happened during that time. But by God's grace, the Iraqis never hurted us. They never hurt us because Indian army, I believe, had trained the Iraqi army. And so Indians had never been hurt during the entire episode. There was, in fact, an instance where my parents were stopped at a checkpost, and the soldier had asked for my dad's watch. It was an Omega watch. So they asked for his watch, and my dad's like, no, I'm not giving it. And they didn't do anything. They just let him go. I mean, we were all in the car, my mom, me, my sister, we were all in the car. And they didn't do anything because we were Indians. And of course, there was God's hand of grace upon us. Toyota Sunny, the guy on whom that movie Airlift was made. He was one of the major forces that God used in getting Indians out of Kuwait back to India.
Wow.
And we got into a bus, traveled through Iraq, through Baghdad. In fact, the checkpost, first major checkpost was at Basra. Baghdad, we had food at a restaurant at Baghdad, and then traveled all the way to the no man's land, the border between Iraq and Jordan. And we stayed in a tent there for 5 days.
Wow.
That was set up by the Red Cross, the UN, the Red Cross. They'd set up like thousands of tents. It's the only time I've ever gone camping in my life. And yeah, it was fun.
Wow.
Pupus and tin fish and yeah, cucumber. So yeah, it was good. At least for kids that
I know.
me and my was good. I'm sure my parents they had a really tense time because you can hardly pack anything when you're running for your life. I mean, 2 months we were in Kuwait, but then when we had to get on the bus, it's not like you can pack up everything and get a U-Haul and move everything. It's the minimum, necessities. We got to Jordan, and then from Amman, there was the airlift operation that was carried out, the largest in the history of that we've ever had. Not just the largest in the history of India, it's the largest in the history of the world. Yeah, the largest airlift operation ever carried out to bring, to fly out all the Indians from Amman to what was then Bombay. And yeah, got a train to Kerala, and believe it or not, the porters wouldn't take money, the taxi drivers wouldn't take money. They drop you wherever you wanted to, but they wouldn't take money. My parents, they gave them the money, but for the most part, they were like, we don't need money. I mean, there was such a spirit of solidarity, of brotherliness, and people in Kerala, it was wonderful. And if you recall, that was one of the times in Kerala where prayer was phenomenal. There was a lot of prayer going
Tell me
up.
the year. Tell me the year.
1990.
Wow.
Yeah. August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein rolled in. In fact, 2 a.m., he rolled in with his tanks. Morning, my mom woke up. She got ready for work, was going to work, and everyone's like, what are you doing? You can't go to work. There's tanks on the road. There's soldiers everywhere. And she's like, no, I have to go to work. And then usually she drives to work, but then that day she asked my dad to drive her to work. She went there. There were Kuwaiti students there. And she reports directly to the director of nursing. At least she used to when she used to work there. And so she just then told all the students, go home. We'll see how things work out from here. Yeah, and then she basically came back home. We lived in Kuwait after that for 2 months. August 2nd, towards the end of September, is when we left Kuwait. And all of this, yeah. So thank God, it was wonderful hand of God over us during that entire time. Parents got called back quickly soon after, back to Kuwait. As soon as the Iraqis knew that they'd lost the war, they set all the oil wells on fire. Oil wells, there were 200 oil wells burning. And I mean, Kuwait had called in people from so many places to put out the oil wells, and everybody was trying everything that they could. There's this guy called Red Adair from the US. He's supposed to be one of the best at putting out oil wells, and even he was helpless. I mean, and then it was a little company in Czechoslovakia that found the way to put out the oil wells, and one by one they just put them all out. And parents would go to work. Daddy and mommy were telling me that they'd go to work, and when you come back, you'd be covered with soot. And yeah, because of all the soot in the air because of the oil wells burning and stuff. So, yeah, so I was in school in Kerala during that time, finished my schooling in Kuwait after that, came back to India, finished my college, did my undergrad, postgrad medicine, and then I worked in Trivandrum, Bangalore, and right now I'm working in Tiruvalla, Kerala.
Got it.
That's basically the highlights. I mean, it's not the highlights, but I mean, for me, one of the biggest, most fascinating times of my life, of course, is the war episode. Yeah, for me, having got saved is about as exciting and as fascinating as that.
Mm.
And I was raised in a mainline church. It's called the Marthama Church. Services were in Malayalam, so I didn't understand much of what was going on. At home, we used to speak English. In school, we used to speak English. So English was mostly our lingua franca, and we really weren't that well versed in Malayalam. So all the high literary Malayalam that was being used in church was quite foreign to me. And so even if they did preach the gospel, I never really heard it in church. When I went to college, I went to a brethren church. They call it independent, but it's mostly brethren. And that's where I first heard the gospel. That's where I got saved. That's where I came to know the Lord. And the day I got saved, man, it was like my eyes were open. It's like I saw the Bible in a whole new light altogether. Up until then, I thought I knew the Bible. I used to win all those memory verse competitions and the Bible quiz competitions and all those things that they used to have in Sunday school. I only thought that, that's all there is to the Bible, those stories in the Bible, and that's it. I knew God was real. I knew Jesus was real. I never doubted the historicity of the Bible or the authenticity of the Bible or anything that was written in the Bible, but there was nothing captivating about it until the day I got saved. And ever since that day, it's been like the Bible opened up to me like a whole new world and treasures out of it every day. And it's been my passion ever since to study the Bible and to read it and study it and ask questions and find answers that no one could give me a satisfactory answer to. So that's been my passion now for many years now. So I just thank God for all that. Morning, I go to work, yes, but I come back, and when I'm free, almost all my time is spent studying the Word and reading theology. So, yeah, that's my passion.
Yeah, that is awesome. And I know we've been together now for, close to, what's that, 15 years. We've known one another 15, 17 years. We met in Bangalore, right? When we met in EU in the school spot. Maybe, right? But when you were telling your story, for me, it was like Israel escaping from Egypt, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you made a similar, it seems to me that it's unusual that God would save the people right from the heartland through the land that the occupiers land, right? It's crazy. And you cross the Jordan into then Malu land, promised land, right?
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. And you were, how old were you with?
I was
8 or 9.
I was 6.
Six.
So for me, Yeah, for me it was all it's like living in a movie. That was the time I first learned the word Scud missile and all those kind of tanks. And as a kid, those are the things that excites you, right? Fights and wars, and you're in the thick of it, and you're not thinking about dying. You're only thinking about, wow, look at that, it's so big, oh, powerful. That's all you're thinking about. You're not thinking about how it might affect your life. So yeah,
Crazy. For a brief moment you were a refugee, right? And just passing through, right, all the way before you got picked up overall, from Oman, right?
yeah. And in fact, that is the exact reason that people back in Kerala refused to take money. My parents forced the money into their hands because my parents, by God's grace, they were doing well. So there's no need to deprive the people here, because a lot of other people were suffering. I mean, we were doing well, but not everyone did well back in Kuwait. There
Yeah.
were a lot of people who suffered quite a bit. And yeah, but my parents knew where they were, and they knew that they could.
Yeah, it's fabulous, fabulous. That 1990 happens to be the year that my dad passed away. February. I don't know when did you guys land? August, right? You said August?
August is when Saddam entered Kuwait.
So you guys came
September, the end of September is when we left Kuwait. I'm a little hazy about whether we reached India end of September or beginning of October.
okay, sometime that range, that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. And so obviously, mom and dad went back, and then you went back as well, right? Back into Kuwait.
Yes.
Okay. And then you finished your schooling there, and then you came for graduation to India, right? Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Got it. And now you're married and you have two babies,
I've got
right?
2 kids. Yeah, 2 girls.
Yeah, that's good. We are common in that aspect. We got two girls. So how is that kind of stage kicked off? It's very different than, when you were bachelor and things like that. How has that changed? How has that changed you being a husband and a dad?
Well, being a husband didn't change me that much. My wife was quite supportive for the time that I spent studying. But after having become a dad, that kind of opened up my eyes to what it means to have a father's love for the child. That is when I probably first came to experience. Of course, I'm not saying that I experienced what God the Father, the level at which He loves us, but a small inkling of what it means for a father to love his child. It's completely different from a man loving a woman. And I'm pretty sure for any father out there, there's a different level of sacrifice that he'd be willing to put in for his kids to make sure that they do well, physically, spiritually, emotionally. Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't it fascinating? Like, the husband and wife, in our, in the spiritual kind of dynamic, it would be Jesus loving the church, right?
Yeah.
It's like, but then when kids come along, it's like the father loving the son. It's, it's a different dynamic, right?
Yes.
Scriptures kind of open up differently, I guess, right? When we experience somewhat of a smaller reality of the greater reality, right? So it's fabulous.
Yeah. I mean, before I got married, that was my thing. I always thought, my marriage should be the kind of marriage that people look at and say, "Oh man, this is just like Christ and the church." But after you get married, after you have kids, the kind of love that you have for the kids far exceeds. Okay,
Right.
kind of. I'm not sure how I should put that without it sounding wrong, but I'm sure the love that a father has for his children is quite different than the kind he has for his wife. It's
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
different. Yeah.
I think, yeah, I think it's different. May not be in terms of gravitas and scale. It should be the same. But there's still that emotional aspect that is not just you loving, but also your wife loving the kids, right? So it's a different kind of dynamic. Right? It's different dynamic. One of the things that I've seen, and you can comment on this, is the sacrifice, right? When we start to read about Abraham's sacrifice or Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, it's you can't even start to imagine what that looks like, because when you have your own, would you give? It's so difficult. It's actually impossible, right?
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know.
now we just say it's unbiblical.
Right. But just the dynamic, just thinking about what that transaction was, it's like, this is crazy. Right?
Yeah.
And especially giving to somebody who's kind of your enemy, that's even more that's worse, right? You could give it to your friend, but would you give to your enemy? That's crazy, right?
But
Crazy.
exactly what all the first century, second century, third century Christians did, right? Now we live in a time when most of us say, fight for your right. We say defend, defend, defend. You know, I mean, I was speaking to my sister-in-law yesterday. She's in the US, and she was saying in her church,
Mm.
uh, every Sunday when they have service, there's two guys with guns in the church, and it's like, I'm like, wow, that's like having an air marshal on planes. That's they
We also have a cop outside.
wow, yeah. So
Yeah.
so yeah, but when we compare that to the first, second, third century church, it's a time when they were willing to let themselves be sacrificed for the spread of the gospel. I'm not saying that having a cop outside is wrong. I'm just saying that
Right.
the way we have seen things now, that way we see things now is not the way that things were being done back in the day. So I have I'm still struggling with this idea of pacifism versus just war. I still don't know. I still don't know how to justify just war. I've heard that Dietrich Bonhoeffer struggled with this. I know that he finally decided to take up arms against Hitler. I know that Eric Metaxas has written a book on this, and where he talks about how Dietrich Bonhoeffer goes through this. And he makes a few good arguments. I'm not sure if we can apply those mostly in our lives. Um, the Anabaptists have a good argument for pacifism. I'm still struggling to understand which is right.
It's such a kind of gray topic that God doesn't give us a straight answer, right? Because in Christ you see pacifism, seemingly, right? But in Israel you see just war, right? If you were to kind of zoom out, right, from a because God says, go, take these guys on, right? He was using Israel as the instrument for clearance. Obviously, Israel didn't listen to what God was saying, and they became synchronistic, uh, um, syncretism, right? Syncretistic
Right.
in their approach, and they didn't drive the people whom God said drive them out, finish them up, right? So that you can kind of see our when it came, I think probably when it came to, yeah, I think it's a paradigm, right? The paradigms, maybe, I don't know, I'm just thinking aloud here. I haven't really thought through as much as you have, Chris, but I'm just thinking the paradigm level is spirit in the spiritual warfare. you give yourself up, but in a physical justice issue, you stand up for the vulnerable. I don't know if that is the case. If the vulnerable are being attacked, if you have the ability to stand between the oppressor and the oppressed in a just, in the physical justice system, I think you do. But in the spiritual world, I think when we get to us being or somebody else being persecuted for the sake of the faith, then maybe, I don't know, that's just a paradigm for me. I haven't thought about it, but
one of the things, the way I put it is, if you look at the laws in the Old Testament, especially the Mosaic law, you've got civil law, criminal law, and ceremonial law, right?
Right.
And then you've got Abraham's circumcision. So you've got civil law, criminal law, ceremonial law, and circumcision. This will cover most of just about everything in the Old Testament law-wise. Now, every time, the only thing that comes out of that possibly is moral law, which is it's also part of it. And what I wanted to say was, as far as the state is concerned, the state has the right to carry out justice. So when God tells the state to go forth and to war against a certain group of people, it's not an individual doing his will. It's the state carrying out the law of God, right? But as far as individuals are concerned,
that's different.
Vigilante justice is not something that is prescribed. In fact, anytime something's been done wrong, it always says there should be 2 or 3 witnesses. Take it before the judge, take it before the priest, inform them, and if the proof is there, the guy who's done wrong gets judged. The important part over there, I feel, is the power in the hands of the layman or the individual to have the power to actually go and complain to the judge, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, in Israel, the law was that if a woman got raped, she had to go to the judge or whoever the person in charge was and inform them, this is what has happened, right? And that person gets brought to trial. And so this idea of shame causing a woman to cover up the wrong done to her is given less weight. And the idea that, yes, you have the power to go and get justice for the wrong done to you is given more weight. So, and it also stops the perpetrator from repeating those wrongs again. So there is a place for the individual to bring forth their grievances, and there is a place for the state to carry out the justice.
Yeah, interesting that when the lady who was caught in the act of adultery was brought before Jesus, right? So it's basically what you're saying is what they were, obviously they had a mean motive behind it, but it was still enacted, right? In some sense of what you're saying when Jesus came down, to be with us, yeah, very good, very good. So this kind of keeps you up at night, right? These kind of discussions and debates, right?
I've been largely concentrating on the idea of original sin and total depravity for the past few years, studying that. Yeah. So that's one of the things. So studying it from the historical perspective, primarily from the biblical perspective, that's how I started off. Then I went into theological perspective of that, and then ended up with what the historical perspective was and how it's changed over the years. And so that's been my main focus for quite a while.
So why don't you give us a sense of what you found in your study?
Yeah. So when someone says, I believe in original sin, the first question that you should ask is, which original sin? Right? Because the Catholic Church has a different definition for it. The Eastern Orthodox Church has a different definition for it. The Reformed churches have a different definition for it. The Anabaptists have a different definition. There's almost a different definition for the word original sin as there are denominations. And it's possible to say, I believe in original sin without actually meaning what the person you're talking to understands by it. Right? So it all starts with trying to figure out what you mean by the term original sin. It's come to mean a lot of different things to different people. Does it connote guilt? Does it get transmitted? These are all questions that theologians have been dealing with for a long time. There's, biblically speaking, the argument for original sin, some people equate that with total depravity, though it's not exactly the same. But the argument for that, let's say total depravity instead of original sin, because original sin can mean just about anything, depending on which church you're from. But the argument for total depravity largely rests on a handful of verses. You can count it on one hand. People might bring in a lot of other verses, but for the most part, it's largely based on Psalm 51, verse 5, Romans 5, 12 to 21. And very rarely people might bring in some other verses also. But it's largely these two verses which are the basis of the idea of total depravity. Now, whenever you're making any doctrine, there's generally an order you follow. So didactic passages get more weightage than narratives, and narrative passages get more weightage than poetic passages, prophetic passages. So you have this hierarchy. You have didactic greater than the narrative, greater than the poetic, prophetic passages whenever you're making doctrine. And even among the didactic passages, you want to make doctrine out of the clearest passages, and you allow the unclear passages to be explained by the clearer passages, right? And ideally, you go to the original languages for that. You go to the Hebrew, you go to the Greek to find out what they actually said, because we have a lot of English translations. And there's a lot of politics that goes on behind many of the English translations. The Geneva Bible is a very political Bible. The King James Bible is a very political Bible. And then, of course, the theology of the translators obviously affects the translation. So if you go back to the original Hebrew or Greek, you get a better idea of what they actually wanted to say, what they actually said. So yeah, so biblically, the idea of total depravity is quite hard to see. When you go to the Old Testament, sometimes people bring in Genesis and they say that Seth was made in the image of Adam. And so that is a proof that after Adam fell, Seth, is no longer an image bearer of God, but rather he's an image bearer of the fallen Adam. That's a questionable idea because you had Abel and Cain before that, and the Bible doesn't say anything about Abel and Cain being in the image of Adam. I think the simpler understanding would simply be that, like when we speak, oh, your daughter's the spitting image of you, man.
Mm-hmm.
When you say the simple meaning is he looks just like his dad, or she looks just like her dad, right? So I think that's all that was meant. I can't be sure. But as we go on through the scriptures, we see that there are people who bear the image of God. And nowhere in scripture do we see the image of God being marred or lost or anything like that. So biblically, it's difficult to get that idea. Now, Psalm 51 verse 5, commonly used. Again, that's a poetic passage. You could use it to say that, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. I was brought forth in iniquity. The Psalm 51 passage is written in the context of David having slept with Bathsheba and then being outed by Nathan the prophet. So, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity would simply mean, behold, I was outed in my sin. And in sin did my mother conceive me. That's the next part.
Thank you, friends, for joining that conversation. You might not agree with everything that Chris said. I don't agree with everything that he said, but that's the beauty about friendship, right? I think we've very narrowly defined friendship to kind of say, we have to agree on absolutely everything and see the world the same way. No, I think there's room for us to dialogue, to discuss, to explore, and to understand one another. And that's the beauty about having friendships that are of diverse thinking and background. So I've enjoyed, as I mentioned, I'm going to probably mention this over and over again, I've really enjoyed the conversation with Chris, and that's the whole thing about Share the Well is we can have conversations and listen to one another, learn from one another. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you have anything to share, please feel free to visit our website. It's www.sharethewell.community, or you can drop us a comment in the platforms that you use to stream your podcasts. Until next week, have a wonderful week, and God bless you. Bye-bye.